Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today we're joined by Dr. Sean Carroll. He is Balo-Simon Professor and Endowed Chair of Biology at the University of Maryland. He is also Professor Emeritus of Genetics and Molecular Biology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today we're going to talk about his book, A Series of Fortunate Events, Chance, and the Making of the Planet, Life, and You. So, Dr. Carroll, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Ricardo.
So, let me first ask you, what does a term like chance mean in the context of evolutionary biology?
I think we just say that an event that is purely random or involves probably so many factors to essentially behave as such as a random event. No, it's not part of any predictable pattern, not of any sort of repeating cause that we could identify and predict. So, close to a roll of the dice, but not always exactly a roll of the dice. Yeah.
So, and what is the distinction between chance and contingency? Because I think that's also important to establish here when it comes to
Yeah.
the evolution of life on Earth.
I think it's constructed to use contingency in the historical sense, which would mean a past event or process that was necessary for a particular outcome. Now, that past event may have been a chance event. So chance events can become contingencies when you think about things that may happen later. So, for example, I talk about in the book the asteroid impact 66 million years ago. Well, that was a highly chance event, but it was a contingency probably for the emergence of humanity. So it's good to have those two. Certainly contingencies used in a lot of different contexts, but I like to use it in the historical context, I think, as some preceding event necessary for following events.
Mhm. And what does it mean to say that life is an improbable event?
Well, you can look at that at various levels. I mean, we don't really know how prevalent life is in the universe, right? So we don't know. We have one example, right? We have life on Earth. But I think when you look at life as we look at it, and you say even our own lives, so let's make it sort of personal. The title of the book, A Series of Fortunate Events, is saying really a whole series of events had to happen a particular way for you and I to be here, to be having this conversation. Events, cosmological, geological events, as well as the biological events that led to the making of you and the making of me, which have some very long odds against them.
Right. So, what are the factors that play a bigger role in geological transitions?
Well, so I certainly talk in the book about a couple of processes. So I begin the book with a description of the asteroid impact 66 million years ago, or with that event, because we could go much deeper in time and we could talk, for example, about the probability of life in the universe or how life on Earth got started. But that's in the mists of time, and science does not have a great grasp on that. But what's happened in the last 100 million years is really clear, and that asteroid impact is the most important event on Earth in the last 100 million years, because it really it erased a lot of evolutionary lineages, and it sort of hit the reset button on life on Earth. So if you consider that a geological event, it has a sort of cosmological origin, but the instantaneous change in the environment, the collapse of food chains, the acidification of the ocean, these things they have geological counterparts, at other times in history. The other thing that's always going on is sort of the slow and steady movement of things like tectonic plates. And the movements of those plates have affected the distribution of creatures on the planet. They affect the climate the planet experiences. Volcanism affects the climate the planet experiences. And volcanism is really the accepted cause of the greatest mass extinction ever at the end of the Permian and the beginning of the Triassic period. So volcanism, tectonic movements, asteroid impacts, these things have been reshaping the surface of the planet. And sort of as the Earth changes, life changes with it. So it has a big factor on what creatures do, including ourselves.
Hmm. So this is another thing you talk about in the book. Why have we had large swings in climate over these past 2 million years?
Well, so the story of that, so the sort of first cause goes back deeper in time, which was if you go back, well, even if you just go back to the Pliocene, there was, um, say, North America was ice free, pretty much to the Arctic, forest covered North America. Greenland did not have sheets of ice, et cetera, in the Pliocene, and the CO2 levels were above 400 parts per million, where we are coming back to now. Um, but what was going on for really 50 or 60 million years preceding that is a fairly steady long-term drop in CO2 levels in the atmosphere from very high levels, post-asteroid. We may have been over 1,000 parts per million, and Earth was a balmy place. But it's thought that, in particular, a collision of the Indian subcontinent, the tectonic plate that contains the Indian subcontinent, which moved rather rapidly from a position near Madagascar to collide with Asia, perhaps about 40 million years ago, that the building of the Himalaya mountain chain actually started to take a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that the drawdown of that CO2 led to greater and greater cooling and eventually the glaciation of the Antarctic. And then the continuation of that cooling essentially tipped us into the ice ages. So the last, 2 million years or so when we've been in the ice age, that's the first ice age in 300 million years. It's a very unusual period on the planet. And during this ice age, because of orbital movements and some other phenomena on Earth, we've been swinging in with at various periodicities, and there are a few periodicities in the ice age. We've been swinging in and out of sort of these glacial periods when, I live in North America, so that the mark of this is very clear across North America, where the ice sheets advance across North America and retreat with cooling and warming. In places like Africa, it's not so much cold and warm as it is wet and dry cycles that you can see manifest in the record in Africa. So life on Earth has been experiencing pretty dramatic swings in climate over millennia during this ice age period, and that's had a dramatic effect on what creatures have persisted and which have disappeared.
I think this is another important event in our evolutionary history, or at least the impact it had on our evolutionary history. In the book, you also talk about the impact of the Indian subcontinent on Asia and its global effects. Could you tell us about that?
Well, this cooling, this drawdown, so the building of mountain ranges, the weathering of rock is a major mechanism for drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so the building of the Himalaya is one geologist described this, as the collision that changed the world. I'd say it's the second collision that changed the world, because the asteroid collision was a really big effect. But that cooling, which has done, and further tectonic movements, for example, the separation of Antarctica from South America, that sort of isolated the Antarctic and made those waters that much cooler, and really dramatic changes in what things lived in both that ocean and on that continent. But the other effect, as I mentioned, Africa, is this wet-dry cycle. And we can see documented in the last 2 million years in places where our ancestors lived, really dramatic changes in climate going through these wet and dry cycles. And so paleoanthropologists, it's pretty widely accepted that this adaptation, or the ability to adapt to these changing climate cycles and our use of tools and things like this, that sort of volatile climate was a driver of human adaptation and human brain size. And so that this ice age has a lot to do with the emergence of humanity. So that collision long ago, 40 million years or so ago, of the Indian subcontinent with the Himalaya has had consequences tens of million years later on what's been evolving in Africa, including ourselves. So again, these chains of events sometimes spread over vast amounts of time, vast amounts of space on the planet, are nonetheless we're able to trace and connect sort of why did this happen over here? Well, you just keep going back and saying, well, it's because of this, which is because of this, which is because of this. And that's the series of fortunate events. The world easily could have, could look different. This is just the world we have, and it's gone through lots of changes.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, in the case of humans and hominins particularly, these environmental fluctuations we've been exposed to during our evolutionary history influenced our evolution in particular ways, right? So, for example, there are people that say that it might have led to the evolution of higher levels of behavioral plasticity and things related to culture and so on. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. When you see the onset of the tool record, which is probably firmly 2.5 million years ago or so, and then you see sort of that changing toolkit through time, the use of fire. So you have a species that can shape its own habitat, right? It's using caves, it's using fire, and obviously developing various ways of communication. But I mean, to me, it's just stunning to look at the 2.5 million-year-old tool record and realize, okay, we're a tool making animal. We're going to use that capability in a variety of ways. We have this, expanding brain volume. So the expanding hominid brain volume is tracking essentially in the progression of the ice age, pretty markedly. Our brain size is going to increase roughly threefold from the onset of the ice age, and that's really dramatic. So we don't think these are coincidences. We think these things are interrelated. And then you see the toolkit get much more sophisticated, particularly, say, in the last 500,000 years or so. And a species that can, with greater cognitive capacity, that can migrate, to food sources or remember where those things are, that can control fire, and we've probably been controlling fire for at least 800,000 years. And fire allows us to clear land. Fire allows us to extract more calories from our food. This is we're a technological ape, for the last couple million years, and that has appeared to give us an advantage, or our ancestors an advantage, in dealing with changes in climate. And part of the data for that is that if you look at other lineages of mammals, their turnover is much greater. So there's a lot of species that, if you look at particular places in Africa, and this has been studied best by Richard Potts and his collaborators at the Smithsonian Institution in an area called Olorgesailie in Kenya, that if you look at the fossil record there, that there's much greater turnover of sort of, typical four-legged mammals in these periods, whereas humans and their ancestors are persisting. And so I think the reasonable inference is that our technical capabilities, our cognitive capabilities, are a response to the volatility of this climate, and enable us to endure and persist evolutionarily.
Mm-hmm. So those are the factors that basically explain the resilience of hominins, right?
I think that's a big factor. Well, you get that bigger brain and you start using it for other things, communication. We domesticate livestock, we domesticate crops, so clearly the last 12 or so thousand years, where we, went from a pretty small population size and have now become, nearly 8 billion, that a lot of that has to do with other innovations, but certainly, again, it's managing our own habitat. Instead of hunting and gathering, we're planting and raising, livestock. And so domestication of animals and domestication of crops, is just, to me, another part of the, the story, but a relatively recent part of the story that certainly triggered an explosion in humanity's numbers.
Right. So zooming out now and looking again at the bigger picture in evolution, is it really the case that genetic mutations are random?
Yeah, I mean, when I say random, they're random in the sense that what occurred, in the making of you, the making of me, and the making of other creatures, we can't predict where those mutations are going to be. There are some spots in any particular genome that might have a little higher rates than others because of features in that DNA. Very repetitive sequences can accumulate more mutations than sequences that are more unique. But that doesn't really bear so much on the general question you're asking. That to sort of put it in specifics, in the making of in an individual human, there are new mutations in every gamete. Every egg or sperm is carrying mutations that didn't exist in the parent. Perhaps on the order of 20, 25 or so per gamete. Those seem to be randomly sprinkled around the genome, and we can see this when we sequence the DNA of children and their parents, and we can see those new mutations. But that's true when we look at every creature. So I think that operationally, mutation is random, and so there are just random changes in the text of DNA occurring every time DNA is copied, whether that's in an individual, in a gamete, in making a sperm and egg, or in the individual cells of our body. Every time our cells divide, there are some mutations, new mutations present that weren't there in the parental cell. And that's just a consequence, really, of the intrinsic properties of the bases of DNA. So we have about 3 billion base pairs of DNA in our genome, and we don't have many mutations, but it's pretty remarkable with what fidelity DNA gets copied. But we now understand, and this is fairly recent work, that mutational process has to do with the chemistry of DNA, and that the bases of DNA exist in some alternative forms. They're sort of flickering between these two forms. And when they're copied, if they happen to be in the less frequent, less common form, the wrong base can get inserted, or the wrong base. For that wrong base means there's a mutation happens. And we may think the mutation has a really negative connotation, but of course we realize that all the diversity of life depends upon this process. If there was no mutation, there would be no diversity. So this mutational process gives us sort of a tolerable amount, generally speaking, of genetic diversity, which explains all of human diversity and contributes to all of the diversity that we see on the planet. So yes, so mutation's random, and in the marvelous way that organisms work, that random process is at the root of all beauty, all diversity, all innovation on the planet.
Mm-hmm. And what are the relative contributions of mutations and natural selection to invention? Do we know that?
Well, I think it's a great question. So what's great is just to parse those two things anyway, natural selection and mutation. So mutation changes DNA, and it changes DNA without any reference to the potential consequences. Those changes just happen. And natural selection is really the sieve that sorts out which of those mutations can persist in populations in future generations. So sort of mutation is the inventor, and natural selection is either the spreader of that invention or essentially the death of that invention if it's something that's disfavored. And so, but there's a cumulative sort of process there, which is there are mutations that happen and they may get spread because of natural selection. And all we're really saying with natural selection is it's just the competition between that mutation and others in the population that's working out, right? And then if that mutation provides some sort of advantage and it increases in frequency, there may be other mutations that come along. And again, those may be spread as well. And so this is a cumulative process that can happen so that many, many changes can add up. Now, we're all following the news on, things like the COVID, virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and we're essentially watching evolution here in real time, right? Because that virus, every time it replicates, there are new mutations. Some of those mutations might give it a slight advantage in infectivity or the ability to evade our immune systems. Some of those many of those mutations have no consequences whatsoever, and some of those mutations actually diminish the virus's ability to replicate or to spread person to person. Well, those mutations will disappear, and it's really the mutations that provide an advantage as this virus goes through millions and millions of people that we see emerging. Relative to the original Wuhan strain, we see various mutations in this virus that have emerged that have given it better infectivity, or now that we're fighting back against it with vaccines and our own immunity, there's an arms race going on between our immune systems and this virus. And, Omicron is a manifestation of probably some adaptation on the part of the virus to that. So this, I never knew that we would have a real world global illustration of mutation and natural selection at work that would be so personal, for everyone on the planet. But that's what we're seeing play out right now.
Mm-hmm. And how do new species evolve? I mean, how do they form? How does speciation occur, basically?
Well, speciation can occur in a variety of ways. And for the longest time, I think that what biologists emphasized was really just geographic mechanisms, geographic isolation. You can imagine that if, just think of birds in the Galapagos or something like that, that if a creature finds a way to get a transport to an island or something like that and is now separated from another population, that as time goes on, those populations will, without any intermixing, become different from one another, so that when a naturalist comes along, say Charles Darwin, and looks at those birds, it's like, oh, well, those are two different species. What's also really happening is that should those populations ever have contact, there's a question of whether they can interbreed. And what's going on with time is that the accumulation of mutations in populations eventually leads to the accumulation of enough mutations that really those genomes or those gametes, sperm and egg from those different populations, are no longer compatible. They can't work together to construct a viable, fertile individual. That takes time, and there's biologists who've estimated that, say, for mammals and birds, that might be about 2 million years. But what that's saying is that speciation itself has a huge component of chance, which is, the chance migration of a few individuals, across a river, across any kind of geographical barrier, a river, a mountain range, across some water to an island, that can lead to the seeding of essentially a new species. And the other chance element is it's these accumulation of random genetic mutations that eventually lead to incompatibilities between populations such that they become separate species. So when you say how do species form, huge component of geological, geographical, and genetic chance.
Mm-hmm. Is there also chance in reproduction, and more specifically in human reproduction?
It's tremendous. You can have, your viewers and listeners can have some fun with this. So I don't know if you want to play a little game, but so our respective fathers and mothers, they had 23 pairs of chromosomes. They're going to donate one of each of those pair of chromosomes to the respective sperm and egg. So you might say, how many genetically unique individuals can any pair of humans make? Given those 23 pairs of chromosomes. And you might think, well, I don't know, is it 23? Is it 46? How does it add up? It's more than 70 trillion. And it's because it's combinatorial. The number of genetically unique sperm or the number of genetically unique eggs is 2 to the 23rd power, which is over 8 million each. And then if you combine those numbers, it's the product of those two numbers that gives you the number of over 70 trillion possible genetically unique children. So in any human fertilization event, relatively about 100 million sperm are competing to be the one sperm that fertilizes the one egg. So out of 100 million contenders, just whatever that one genetic combination was is, the winner of the sperm race. And, that happened to make you, that happened to make me. But there were 70 trillion combinations that mom and dad could have had. So really that means that no two fertilized human eggs will ever be genetically the same, on this planet. And I'm only talking about the sorting of chromosomes. There's other genetic mechanisms, recombinations of chromosomes, and random mutations that assures that actually that 70 trillion number is an underestimate. So in biological reproduction in humanity, there's a huge role of chance, and that huge role of chance means we have almost an astronomical number of combinations of unique genetic identities. So we're all special. That point of view. We're also a matter of luck, but some could see that as we're all special.
Okay. Why is it that you also talk about cancer in your book?
For exactly the same reason, in that as every one of our cells divides, its DNA is being copied and mistakes get made. And and cancer is fundamentally a genetic disease. Um, it's the malfunctioning regulation of cell division. We know that it's due to mutations in a set of roughly about 150 genes are now known to contribute to cancer. That number might have grown just a little bit. And it's a multi-hit phenomena where it usually takes mutations in at least two or more of those genes to get the manifestation of uncontrolled cell growth. Well, if you just picture, from the time you were young, your cells dividing and renewing your tissues, your skin tissues, your intestinal lining, the growing of your white cells, for example, that defend you. Well, over time, mutations accumulate, and so the chance that two of these mutations will accumulate in key genes in the course of one's lifetime is a cumulative risk. So we have about 100 times the risk of cancer at, say, age 65 or 70 than we do at age 30. We have a cumulative lifetime risk of cancer, and this is due to the cumulative mutations. And, this is just something we need to know. Now, there's other things we can do that increase the number of those mutations. Smoking tobacco, we know that there's mutagens that increase the damage to DNA and chemical modification of DNA in tobacco smoke. That increases the mutation rate. And you can see that in lung cancers. Lung cancers have really the greatest number of mutations of any cancers in the body. And it's also in our skin. We're exposed to ultraviolet light and other agents in the environment all the time. So skin cancer is very, very common. And when you look at skin cancers, they usually carry lots of mutations overall in the skin cancer. So that's why if you can wear sunscreen to kind of reduce, and as an Irishman, I'm pretty faithful in using sunscreen. So there's some things we can do to protect some of our tissues or to not expose our tissues to agents that will increase the frequency of mutations. But it's really important to understand that really the way cancer arises is really just the way also sort of adaptations happen in nature. Those cancer cells that accumulate mutations that give them a little bit of a growth advantage and then accumulate more mutations, those cells can take off and essentially grow in an unrestricted way. They have that growth advantage. That's mutation and natural selection working to our disadvantage inside our own bodies. So really, we an understanding of the fundamentals of evolution is really important to understanding the fundamentals of the origin of cancer.
Mm-hmm. So one last question: does the role of chance in our existence have any philosophical implications, and do you care about those?
That's two questions, Ricardo.
Yeah.
I think it does have philosophical implications, and this we might spend the most time on this question. I think this is a room where everyone has some room to engage. I think the details of the science are hard for non-scientists to get at, the chemistry, the genetics, and all that. But if you accept that everything from asteroids to sliding tectonic plates to the flickering changes and mutations in DNA is contributing to diversity on this planet, that is a very, very different view than the last 2,000 years of human thought. So yes, it has a lot to, I think, to contribute philosophically. I think the first person who took this on in a serious way is one of my heroes, is the biologist Jacques Monod, who in 1970 wrote a book called Chance and Necessity. And that he was a founder of the field of molecular biology. The genetic code had just been cracked, so we really understood that mutation was a change in the genetic code. And he thought that these new ideas from biology needed to be shared with the general audience. And so Chance and Necessity, it got a lot of attention. It riled up a lot of philosophers and theologians who probably saw biologists as encroaching, on their territory. But Monod was a brilliant person. He was extremely well read, and he could hold his ground on philosophical history as well as on molecular biology. But I realized that 50 years later, we'd learned a lot more. We didn't know about the asteroid impact in 1970. We didn't know about the influence of tectonics on the changing climate. We didn't know the details of cancer. We didn't really know the details of mutation either. So I wrote this book in some ways to revisit the subject of chance, which I still think has been under-discussed, and even in scientific biology circles, sort of under-taught as a central theme, as a main theme in thinking about the course of life, the huge role of life in the making of the planet and the making of species, the making of individuals. So, philosophers and theologians, well, certainly theologians generally don't find chance a very comfortable subject. Certainly, as I'm most familiar out of the Christian tradition, there's been over the centuries, a lot of thinking about the role of a creator in human affairs, whether that's, conception or our health or whatever it might be. But when you understand that chance is entirely sufficient to explain, the making of a new individual, the making of genetic diversity, the adaptation of creatures to their environments, that changes the role of a creator in a lot of people's minds. And since most of these discoveries have happened in the last 50 or 70 years, that's not a lot of time for humans to adapt their thinking. So, I'm interested in the philosophical angles because I think this is something that biology in particular can contribute to culture in general, is that we have insights into where we came from and how we got here. And they're very different than the stories we've told ourselves for a couple thousand years. So we should be updating that story with a more empirically based understanding of how we got here and how everything got here.
Right. So the book is again a series of fortunate events, chance and the making of the planet, life and you. Apart from the book, Dr. Carroll, where can people find your work on the internet?
Well, in sort of various ways. So, I mean, as a published researcher in evolutionary biology, there's lots of public sources in the U.S. For example, PubMed will lead you to lots of articles. I've written books on evolution before. I wrote a book called Endless Forms Most Beautiful, which is also in Portuguese. I've written a book called The Making of the Fittest, which is also about this evolutionary process, and about some great pioneers in evolution, a book called Remarkable Creatures. And then depending upon where you are, I've been deeply involved in documentary filmmaking for the last 10 or 12 years. So that's a variety of films that I've been associated with, including one called The Serengeti Rules, that was based on my previous book and is sort of about some of the rules that govern, the ecological rules that govern nature. So you can find little pieces of things that I've tried to contribute to the overall dialogue.
Okay, I will be leaving links to some of those in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Carroll, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure, Ricardo. Thanks so much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running. I will leave links in the description box to Patreon and PayPal. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Ernst Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windaga, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columber, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Des Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidi, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, My Producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafinia, Keon Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Thomas Trumbull, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.